1855, when Congress passed an act to have a more effective Navy, what they did was they got rid of so many of us from the South. They dumped us. Within 2 months, my 16-year-old son died. That was the government. But my country remains the United States and will remain the U.S.
He's a feisty old soul.
I think we've got everybody, the president accounted for. Colonel, you need to be quiet. Or Don Hakenson did that. I want to just tell you a few things about the program. Those of you who are seated because compliments of Sherman Property. Steve Sherman is on our board, and he paid for the chairs to come in today. This is a free, give Steve a hand. This is a free event, but the Rose Hill PTA is here selling hot dogs. I just had one and they're delicious. Don't let them go home with any hot dogs. Have a hot dog and a Coke, something called a taco in a bag. I'll let them tell about that. Imagine Rose Hill, those of us who live here, in the early 1700s, when the Rose Hill house was first built. Think about it, 1700, that's a long time ago. French Delany built the house, and he also started the construction of Colgate Church at a particular time. He didn't live to see the church finished, so a guy named George Mason, Dunstan Hall, finished the job. Delany was buried in front of the house. We have a display over there that shows pictures of the house going back to 1925. And Colonel Delany was buried in the middle of what is now the cul-de-sac at the end of the main road. And when the houses were developed, and unfortunately burned the house down before Don and I came along and could stop it. They burned the house down, but they did move Colonel Delany, and he is now interred at Colgate Church. So there have been a number of owners of the property. This area has a rich history. Lots of Civil War encampments here. General Sherman's troops camped here after the war to prepare them and the horses and the equipment for the Grand Victory March down Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of things that happen here. Today we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of Mosby's Rose Hill Raid. And we have players that have come a long way and doing a great job. And they're each are going to tell you a little bit about their role. And Don is going to set the scene and tell you about the raid, how Mosby got here, and introduce the other folks. Don?
Let's give him a hand. Let's give Mosby a hand. Mosby Strangers. Are you happy to be here? There's always one in the crowd. I'm going to tell you the story of the Rose Hill Raid, and then I'm going to introduce John Singleton Mosby. On the 27th of September of 1863, Mosby with 5 or 6 men came in to Fairfax County, and he wanted to capture the Lieutenant Governor Francis Pierpont. He goes into Alexandria, and he goes to the City Hotel. Does anybody know what the City Hotel is today? Gadsby's Tavern. But luckily for Francis Pierpont, he's called into Washington City, and Mosby changes his plan. And he goes down to Cam Run, and he destroys a trestle. And then one of the rangers with Mosby is French Delany, Colonel Delaney's son. He says, I know where the aide Francis Pierpont is living. He is staying at the Rose Hill Manor House. They make their way to the house. Anne Thrope writes about them arriving at the house. She talks about how Mosby walked into the room on the second floor and says, Mosby, and walks along the wall. Delany walks in. He sees his father and he says, "Pa, it's good to see you."
It's not good to see you.
There you go. That's documented. That's true. We just reenacted that a few minutes ago. They brought, Mosby would bring Daniel Delany back to Baltimore County and would send him to Richmond. And he would be placed in the Castle Thunder. And he would stay there for a year and a half. He would be exchanged and come back to Fairfax County, and he would survive the war. Delany, his son, would be involved in a fight in Herndon with the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry, and he would be mortally wounded. Here's the sad thing about the tale. 150 years later, we have no idea where Daniel Delany, the Union Colonel, or Delany, the Mosby Ranger, are buried today. That's a sad tale. So if anybody should happen to come across the final resting place, please let me know. At this time, I would like to introduce, Major John Singleton Mosby. Major Mosby.
Thanks for coming out today. Beautiful day. One less game we got to worry about.
As you can imagine, I wasn't quiet in the prison. They ended up exchanging me with a Confederate colonel. Depending on how you pronounce his name, it's either Crochet or Crotchet. I'll leave it to you to decide. Here's my son.
How you guys doing? I captured my father on this raid, and as you hopefully you guys heard, as I entered, I said, "I'm happy to see you, Paul." Obviously, he was happy to see me. I rode with Mosby's Rangers, and Mosby's Rangers were, military uses of this like the whole Confederate Army.
American taxpayer. I got one more thing to say. There were some newspaper reporters down in Augusta, Georgia, and in their paper, the Daily Constitutionalist, on October 3rd, 1863, they described my capture, and they said I was inebriated. Wow. I'll drink to that.
There's a little story I forgot to tell you, but I've got to pass it on. Mosby wrote a letter to his wife about the Rose Hill raid. He wrote about how they were about to leave, and the father said to the son, "Downstairs, there's some old shoes. And I know how scarce they are in the Confederacy." And Delany had just been on a raid with John Singleton Mosby a week before, and they had captured a sutler's wagon. Does anybody know what a sutler's wagon is? It was a wagon that sells goods. And they had captured a sutler's wagon that was selling leather goods. And in that letter, Mosby wrote to his wife, he said that Delany bent down, pulled up his pant legs, and showed him some brand new Union boots, and said something to the effect, "Courtesy of the U.S. government." You can't make that up. Colonel Delany, sir, you step over here. You were a Virginian. Is there anything you want to talk about on your life? What you did after the war?
Well, after the war, I still had my political aspirations. We in Alexandria formed a Rudolph of the Radical Republican Party. And I ran for mayor of Alexandria, and I did not, surprise, surprise, win. But I would really like to say, on behalf of the people of Alexandria, when my son died in 1864, you were kind enough to put in your newspapers that he was a good man. Yes, he was a Confederate. He was an American. We're both good men.
Thank you, Colonel Delany.
Oh, one last thing. The House of Representatives in 1877. They finally heard my complaints about how my personal property had been ransacked back in 1861. Congress was a bit slow, I'd say. I had several oil paintings hanging in my home, and they never discovered who had ruined it. Someone cut the face of one of the family members, and the other two had been taken. I had about 2,500 books stolen from me. I was asking to be reimbursed about $1,500. Congress gave me $500. Thank you, Congress.
He also was clerk of the court in Fairfax County. He was a politician, and he was well respected.
A statesman! Statesman, please!
I'm not giving him the mic. I want to turn this over to a woman who lived just down the road in Wilton Hill. She served or lived under Union occupation for the entire war. And her name was Ann Frobel.
Because, of course, you know, in my time, I would never call a gentleman by his first name unless I was him. No, I'm sorry. Mr. Hakenson. Now, you know what this area was like back then? Do you realize that this entire area was under Union occupation? Did you know that? Do you know that if you lived here, that you would have to get a pass to even go into place? It was a hard life. So before I start reading some excerpts from the journal that I kept during that period of time, I just want to give you a tiny bit of background about what was going on. First of all, you might be interested to know just briefly about my father. Mr. Fromel was a musician. He sang. He was a wonderful musician. In fact, when he was 9 years old, he actually performed for President and Lady Washington. And they were so impressed with him that they really wanted him to come to Mount Vernon. But it didn't happen. Years later, after the President and Lady Washington was deceased, his nephew, Judge Bushrod Washington, inherited Mount Vernon. They too knew Mr. Fromel, and they invited him to come and to be the music master at Mount Vernon. Now, isn't that something? Now, we actually were able to go visit Mount Vernon with my father. That was such a wonderful experience, and the Washingtons were such lovely people. Now, you know, my mommy and my daddy, my mom and my pop, they named one of my brothers after Mr. Washington. So, I have two brothers right now who are fighting for the Confederacy. One is Bushrod and one is David. And you know, the whole war goes on and I don't hear from them. We can't get any correspondence coming from here. I don't even know what's going on with my own brothers. They do survive the war, I will tell you that. So now let me share with you some of the excerpts from my journal that I kept. Now, living with me is my sister Lizzie. We're the only two in that house called Wilton Hill. Our parents are dead, and the brothers are gone, and it's just us two young ladies living in this house alone with our servants. We have about 5 servants at this point, but of course as the war goes on, they'll start to disappear. But initially they were very helpful to us, and they helped to protect us. And I want that to be known to people, that they were good to us. Now, when the war began, very early, the Union troops came to Wilton County. It was such a lovely place. It was an abundant place. It was a working farm, and it was lovely. Lizzie and I kept a beautiful garden. My father had also been known for his gardening. Everybody around would ask him advice on his landscape techniques. And we tried to maintain that garden, and of course we grew what we needed, vegetables and things like that for our use. Well, those Union troops came, and they just sat right down in our yard, literally right up against the house. I mean, we had no privacy whatsoever. These guys were everywhere, and I don't mean to be rude, but you know what soldiers are like. I don't care which side they're on, they can be really rude and nasty.
We were hungry.
And these people, they said some things to us that, my goodness, my delicate southern ears was just offended at what these gentlemen on foot were saying to us. It was a hard time for Lizzie and me. So these people descended on us. We had to feed them. We had to take in boarders, their old Yankee wives and girlfriends and who knows what these women were. Came in and they boarded in my house. I had to feed them and take care of them. Keep my mouth shut because all around us people were being burned out. People were losing their homes. And Lizzie and I did everything we could to maintain our home. That's all we had. It had been left to me by my dad, specifically left to Lizzie and me. Why, during the war, the government wanted to take my house because they said it was my brother's. I had to go prove to them. I showed them my daddy's will and proved that house belonged to Lizzie and me. So thank God we kept our house. Okay, now let me read to you March of 1862. This is the 29th. Lizzie and I walked up to Mr. Reed's this evening and on the road met Colonel Delany. He told us that General Sigel was at Fairfax Courthouse with 10,000 men and General Beauregard at Manassas, but that everything is quiet as far as he knows. He seems to know as little about what's going on in the Army as we poor creatures, who hold no one rank among them. He's a Virginian, as are all his forefathers, since the time they came over from England. He still holds the title of colonel among the Yankees, but never seems to take part with the Army or have anything to do whatever. He is a very kind and polite man to all the people around, and is ever ready to do them any kindness in his power. He's always full of jokes and has something pleasant to say to everyone he meets. So that is March of 1862.
I was hungry.
Now we're going to go to October of 1862, and let's see what I've got here. Okay, we were introduced while in Rose Hill to Colonel Revere of the 7th New Jersey. He seemed to be there on a visit to Colonel Delany. He talked of his being last winter in Maryland and said at one time his regiment guarded Bud's Ferry. I remember that Bushrod, my brother remembered, I remember that Bushrod was just opposite in Cockpit Point, but of course I did not say so. You know, my house was only about a mile and a half from Rose Hill, and we were always glad when we could see a friendly face, even if it wasn't a friendly face, because this gentleman was to us. Okay, now we've got November 26th. The band played until 11 o'clock last night at Fort Lyon. Now, Fort Lyon was right across from where I live. I have never heard it at such a late hour before. Colonel Delany called here. He let the sutlers know they could now obtain passes and that it was high time for them to leave. I was much obliged to him for the information he brought me. He says there was a battle at or near Leesburg yesterday, but with what result he does not know, as there are 10,000 rumors afloat, except that there were great numbers of sutlers and all their stores captured by the Confederates. January 19th. Colonel Delany called and wishes to know if we would take the responsibility of having a guard placed over the Davis property. The Taylors are going to move away from there and just leave it to the mercy of the soldiers. Lizzie told him we had nothing to do with it. She had written once to the family on the subject at old Mr. Taylor's request, and they had taken no notice of her letter, and any further interfering would seem intrusive. Colonel Delany seems to know very little more about the Army movements than we do.
Top secret, top secret.
He says, however, a great number of troops have been sent within the past 2 days up the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. Colonel Tate, who has commanded all of the forces in and around Alexandria, has orders to be in readiness to march in 12 hours, and that Burnside's left wing has again crossed the Rappahannock. The 29th of January. This morning the sun came out cheerily bright and warm. Colonel Delany was so kind as to call and inquire how we're getting on, and to bring us some newspapers. The Baltimore Sun is filled with good news, but dissatisfaction and discord, the Army, Congress, and all the Yankee people are at war with each other. Since the battles of Fredericksburg, 3 major generals have retired, either at their own request or that of someone else. Burnside, Sumner, and Franklin are the 3 who the Wheel of Fortune has this time depressed. The 9th of March. Charles came home this morning with the news of a raid on Fairfax Courthouse. Now, Charles was my servant. Charles was married to a lady in Washington City. And so when the weekends would come, Charles would always go to see his wife and his family there in Washington City. But it got so, like I said, that everybody needed passes, and this is one of the problems that Charles started having was trying to get these passes. And one of the things that was so helpful was that Charles was able to bring us food supplies from the town. So that was something that was very necessary for us. So he came home this morning with news of a raid on Fairfax Courthouse last night by Captain Mosby's partisan Rangers. Among a great many other captures they secured General Stoughton and staff. The man at whose house the general was quartered came down this morning with the news. Colonel Delany also came from that neighborhood and confirmed the news. He says, but for his horses getting lame, which obliged him to stay at Gooden's all night, he would have been among the missing this morning. Isn't that interesting?
I wasn't drinking.
They don't call it tavern for nothing, Colonel Delany.
My horse, hungry.
Colonel Delany, this is Wednesday the 25th of March. Colonel Delany and Mr. Reed, who were just from town, say there is something going on in the Army, but everything is done with such secrecy that they could not find out what. But both are impressed with the belief that it is not being very favorable to the Yankee cause. Troops are still moving towards Centerville. Expectations of obtaining one, as very stringent orders have been this week issued by the War Department, that none were to have a pass except those who apply in person and consent to take the oath. Now, how about that? I could not get a pass to go into Alexandria to get my food or to do any shopping unless I took that darned oath of allegiance to that Yankee nation. Almost there. We're up to 63. While we were talking to Mr. Reed, Colonel Delany wrote up, said he has seen an official dispatch. There is no doubt Hooker has possession of Fredericksburg and all the defenses in the neighborhood and has captured an immense number of guns and ordnance stores. Has flanked and thoroughly whipped Lee's army at Chancellorsville.
Hey, I wasn't drinking that, but it sounded good.
Now, this is not going to reference Colonel Delany, but this does reference Rose Hill. It said, "We were much gratified and delighted this evening by a visit from our friends at Rose Hill." That would be the Masons of Rose Hill. "There is a feeling of pleasure I cannot describe in seeing and welcoming a familiar and loved face after weeks and months of solitary confinement, especially so when their feelings and sentiments are in unison with our own, and too when you can talk unreservedly." See, that's what's so important for you to remember, is that, again, throughout the duration of the war, these girls were constantly surrounded by people that they could not feel free to even discuss their own feelings around. So when they knew that they had a friendly face to talk to, it was a real treat. And they didn't get to see their neighbors all that often, so it was always a treat to see somebody. She talks in, this is late 1860, well, it's just before this capture took place. The girls had been invited over to a friend's house because at that time the Rangers had started infiltrating and coming to safe places in the area, and they would deliver correspondence and that sort of thing. So up to this time, they had never even seen a Confederate soldier. I mean, because you can imagine, they were surrounded by thousands of Union troops. So it's her chance now to go over to a house. It says, "The next time was my turn to go, and I was more fortunate. I met and spent the evening with Captain Kinchlow and 5 or 6 of his men. There were several young ladies there, and we all spent a very pleasant evening. We laughed and talked like old times, although we were very near the road, which was thoroughly picketed, and we were directly under the guns of Fort Lyon. And when we parted, Captain Kinchlow cut off a button of his coat and gave it to me. They were the first Confederate soldiers I had ever seen, and this is late 1863. Actually, this was the very next paragraph. It says, "One night, a party of Mosby's boys came very unexpectedly to Rose Hill and took off Colonel Delany. One of them was his own son. I was very much amused when I heard the story and the whole scene narrated. This boy's first greeting to his father when he rushed into the room where the father was in bed, in his gruff, boyish voice said, 'How do, Pa? Very glad to see you.' And the father answered, sitting up in bed with proper dignity, 'Well, sir, sorry to see you.' They took him down to Richmond nevertheless. I laughed, although I always liked Colonel Delany. And think it was well for me to have such a person in the neighborhood. He is kind-hearted and inoffensive, and could do and did do many things for the people around him that they could not have gotten done otherwise.'" So that is her last reference, of course, to Delany.
We've got more for you, but I want to take a moment to introduce a couple of people who are very supportive of what we do in the Franklin Museum and here in Rose Hill and throughout me district. First is from State Delegate Mark Sickle. You can go down and say hello, Mark.